If you have Visual Studio Code installed on your Windows operating system and you have the Windows subsystem for Linux installed, there's one step that you need to do to integrate the two of them. To show you what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. VS Code has a lot of great shortcuts that help you develop faster, and you can see some of them if you close any tabs that are up here when you first open up the editor. Here are some useful shortcuts. I won't explain any of these right now, and one that I will explain that isn't listed here is Control tilde or Control backtick. If you press Control tilde or Control backtick, we get this integrated terminal built right into VS Code. Basically, this terminal right here is a PowerShell terminal. If we click the plus button here, we could open up another terminal, and you can see over here on the sidebar, we can have any number of terminals open to develop with. You can close terminals that you open by hovering over a line item and clicking the little trash can icon. Now, it's great that we have an integrated PowerShell terminal, but what we really want is a Linux terminal. And more specifically, we want a terminal that's used inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux. To set that up, I'll go over here to the sidebar, and you can see these little boxes together. If you click on this icon, this will take you to the Extensions Marketplace. One of the great things about VS Code is the fact that it has a lot of extensions, both maintained officially by Microsoft and also by the community. In the extensions search bar, we'll search for WSL, and the first one that comes up is the official WSL extension by Microsoft, so let's install that. A lot of extensions will have a blurb describing what they do. In the middle of this README, they answer the question, why do I need the WSL extension? This is a better explanation than I could give myself, so I'll just read it out loud. The Windows subsystem for Linux, which we have installed, lets you run a Linux environment, including command line tools and applications directly on Windows, without the overhead of a traditional virtual machine or dual boot setup. Very true. The Windows subsystem for Linux especially helps web developers and those working with Bash and Linux-first tools, i.e. Ruby and Python, to use their toolchain on Windows and ensure consistency between development and production environments. Thanks for validating me, Microsoft, that production software usually is running on Linux. Now that we have the Windows subsystem for Linux VS Code extension installed, I'll show you how it works. First, I'll close out of this README. I'll go over here to this plus button and click the little drop-down arrow. Here we can see that you can choose which type of shell you run when you open up a new terminal. So I will click Ubuntu 20.04. And look at that. Just like that, we've opened up an integrated terminal in VS Code that's opened up a session in the Windows subsystem for Linux. And if we do echo $shell, we can see that the shell used in the Windows subsystem for Linux is Bash by default, which is great. But can we edit files using VS Code directly in the Windows subsystem for Linux? I'll use the command line now to create a directory inside the Windows subsystem for Linux, and then I'll show you how we can open up that folder as a workspace in Visual Studio Code. So I'll run mkdir example folder. That seems to have succeeded. Awesome. Let's do ls. The output of this command is a little chaotic, but you can see right here, example folder. So great, it was successful. I'll use cd to go inside now. And now I'll run the code command to open up the current working directory in VS Code. Look at this. VS Code's downloading a VS Code server inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux, and now we have a new window open. I'll go ahead and close out of the original window because we won't need that one anymore. If you notice down here on the bottom left, now we have this WSL Ubuntu 20.04. So this is essentially telling us that the VS Code client, which is the UI right here, this application that we're interacting with on our Windows host operating system, has established a remote connection with a VS Code server that's running inside of the Windows subsystem for Linux. Again, I'll click up here in the upper left-hand corner to open up the File Explorer. It looks like we don't have a folder that's actively opened as a workspace, and so it looks like just running the code command from the Windows host wasn't sufficient. It looks like that, well, running the command from the Windows host did establish a connection to the VS Code server running in the WSL. A workspace was not actually opened up. So I'll open up an integrated terminal one more time, and if you notice, the little blue path right here that we're sitting is different than the one we were sitting in when we opened up the integrated terminal from the host OS in VS Code. If I do pwd now, we can see that the directory I'm in is home/Eric. The directory that we were in before when we created our example folder directory and then went inside was actually sitting on our Windows file system, which we see as a shared drive in the subsystem for Linux. So if I do ls, we don't actually see anything because there are no folders here. Let's create another example folder, make dir example folder. Now we'll cd inside that one and run the code command again. Here we go. Finally, we can see that we've opened a folder inside of WSL as a workspace in VS Code, but in the VS Code that's running on the Windows host so that we can edit it freely. And if you look here in the upper left, you can see that our workspace is called example folder, all caps. So the workspace is always called the name of the folder that you've opened up, all caps. And then it has these nice brackets telling us that we're inside of the Windows subsystem. So if I click this little page with a plus icon, we can create a file. So let's create a sample Python file that'll be empty. So we'll call it hello.py. I won't install the recommended extensions for Python just yet. We'll do that in another video. But we can try typing print hi, and there it is, a Python text file that's sitting inside of our Windows subsystem for Linux. I'll go ahead and save it. And now I'll exit out of VS Code, and I'll show you how we can get back here from scratch. Now that VS Code is closed, I'll show you how I normally open VS Code once everything's properly installed like we have it now. Specifically, we're trying to, once again, open up the folder that we just created in the WSL, but as a workspace on our Windows host machine. I'll go back down to the search bar, and I'll actually search for the Ubuntu distribution that I installed, which is my Windows subsystem for Linux distribution. So I'll search for Ubuntu, and I'll click on it. And this opens up the Windows subsystem for Linux terminal that we saw when we first installed the Windows subsystem for Linux. We can see that the directory that it brought us to is the home directory again. I'll do pwd, and we can see that it's home/eric, just like when we opened it up in VS Code. I'll do ls, and we can see example folder. And now I'll cd inside example folder. Now I'll run the code command again to open up our current directory as a VS Code workspace, but this time I'll put a dot in the command just to show you that we can use this command to open up any file or folder in VS Code, but displayed on the host Windows operating system. And there it is. We've done it. We've reopened VS Code, and we can see the same Python file that we just created. Let's open up an integrated terminal again. And I'll do ls, and we can see the very same hello.py that we created. We can do cd pwd, and we are back in the home directory from the integrated terminal. If you followed along as we went through this exercise, great job. And if not, good luck implementing it yourself, and I will see you in the next one.